Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Deadhead Cannabis Show. I'm Larry Mishkin of Mishkin Law in Chicago, joined as always by Rob Hunt of Linnae Holdings out in lovely San Diego with Dan Humiston producing. Rob, how you doing today?
I'm good, Larry. Fired up to listen to some of the songs we're going to hear today and talk about what's happening in the industry.
Yeah, it's a great day on both fronts. So before we talk too much, let's dive right into it. We're playing today from the Grateful Dead, September 26, 1980 at the Warfield Theater in San Francisco. This was one of the Reckoning/Deadhead shows with a acoustic set followed by two electric. We'll talk more on the backside. Here's the opener.
To lay me down once more, to lay me down. With my head in spark and clover, let the world go by. Like clouds astray.
It was a great set of shows. I was not at any of them, unfortunately. But we're going to be focusing today from the acoustical set. To Lay Me Down is a great tune to start with. They started with it that night. And the fun little fact about To Lay Me Down, if you heard the crowd give a little roar at the beginning, it was because the first time they had played it in 311 shows dating back to October 19th, 1974, which at first shocked me because that seemed like a low number of shows until I remembered that they played no shows in 75. So that made the number seem a little more in line. But I've always loved that tune, Rob, and it's such a beautiful tune when they play it acoustic.
Yeah, I love that song as well. I'll tell you, lyrically, it's a tough song to sing. You know, there's times that Garcia has a little tougher time hitting some of those notes, and it caused him to really show his full range. And sometimes he gets it, and sometimes he doesn't. And I think even in that clip, we heard him struggle a little bit on that. But this whole run, there was a lot of breakouts, and that's the cool thing about when you step out of your comfort zone of playing electric and start playing acoustic, because you have to think about other material that works as an acoustic set rather than as an electric set. And some things you can transfer, relatively easily, and some you can't. So for them to be able to do this is just a much different style than what they're used to. But I love it. I loved hearing all those shows, and I loved what came out of it between Reckoning and Dead Set.
Yeah, it was really the first live Dead that I got into when I first started listening to him, because my good buddy Mike was very into it and playing it all the time. And some of the songs we're going to be listening to here in a few more minutes are going to be tunes that I remember listening to as far back as the summer of 1981, which would have been right after this album came out. And the joy was eventually seeing some, though not all of them, in concert. Although it's interesting how some of these transfer over from acoustic to electric and back again. And we will dive more into this show in a few minutes, so please stick around for that because it's going to be great. However, we really need to focus, I think, for a minute on marijuana news. In terms of news stories that I had kind of lined up for us to talk about today, we still have the downward one about marijuana companies laying off hundreds of workers. But significantly, there are at least two news stories that I think are very, very positive and favorable for the cannabis industry. And it's important that we get started with that. And this one was a last-minute surprise coming from the Illinois Appellate Court 3rd District. And Rob, tell me what you think about this. The Appellate Court held that the smell of any burnt cannabis without any corroborating factors is not enough to establish probable cause to search the vehicle, and therefore the appellate court saying the trial court did not err in granting the defendant's motion to suppress. This is a game changer. What do you think?
I think it's a game changer if law enforcement actually adheres to it. I think you and I are both very suspect that the police are not going to say, "Hey, I smell weed, and give me permission to search your car." The second you give permission is the second that it doesn't matter if there's probable cause or not, even if they use false pretense in doing so. But if you were to say, "No, you can't search my car," and you're adamant about saying, "No, you can't do it because of the smell of cannabis or the smell of burnt or unburned cannabis," Look, I mean, that's something that's like, here's where body cams come in. Here's where cams from citizens come in. But for everyone listening out there, never give probable cause. If a cop asks, "You've been drinking?" The answer is no. I don't care how much you had to drink. The answer is no. Let them figure out their probable cause. If you've been smoking joints for the last 4 days in your car and you're high as can be, and they go, "Have you been smoking weed?" The answer is no. The police officers aren't there to determine whether or not you're guilty. That's for a court of law. Police officers are there to see whether or not they can get a charge on you. So, the less you say, the better. And denying is everything. Anyone tells you you can't lie to a cop, look, I promise you, they're going to lie to you. So, not to be cynical about the police out there, but I can tell you right now that I've had multiple experiences where police officers have absolutely looked at me in the face and lied while going through an interrogation. So, for them to say you can't do that. So, look, I love the idea that courts are now holding this, and I love the idea that you have to establish probable cause in other ways, which there's plenty that law enforcement can still find. But for those people out there that get a charge based on a police officer saying it started off with the smell of weed, and they refuse to search, I hope they all go free, and I hope the law enforcement stops lying about their rationale for searching people's vehicles. Because you want to talk about the easiest possible way in the world to establish probable cause. This is an instant out for a cop. Oh, I smelled weed. We had probable cause. Okay, well, who's going to say you did or didn't smell weed? Who's the more credible witness? Is always the police officer against the defendant, and whatever they found after that was technically admissible. And as you and I know in the law, if you find something after not having probable cause, it's referred to as the fruit of the poisonous tree. So, maybe explain to our listeners, kind of what that means and why this is so important.
I will, and that's a great summary, and I have to, because of that, give a shout out to a guy that we all know, Michigan attorney Matt Abel, who's been the president of Michigan NORML forever and an early player in the legal cannabis industry. One of the first guys I ever met out in Seattle, right when I was meeting Jim Marty too. And I'll never forget Matt Abel, after sitting around with me and smoking a joint, got up to give his presentation and walked right up to the microphone and, like a preacher in a church, yelled out, "Okay, everybody, stand up and repeat after me. No, just say no when the cop pulls you over. No, when the cop asks you a question. No, your answer is always no. Does everybody understand?" And they all yelled no. And he said, "Good." And then he got up and he gave his presentation on commercial cannabis and whatever he was talking about. But it was a great message. And I took that and transitioned it enough that I could take it home to my boys when they were getting to an age where they and their buddies were starting to go out and potentially get in situations. And it paid off once for one of my sons who told the cop, no, no, no. And the cop said, "We're going to get a dog." And he said, "I don't care. The answer is no." And the cop never caught the dog. They called the bluff, and ultimately they walked away. I think not unlike your incident, Rob, where when you called the cops bluff, he actually at that point backed down too. But it's always a game of gotcha, right? We've always known that. Cops won't give a Miranda warning. And if you're not smart enough to know what a Miranda warning is, you might not even know that your rights have been violated. And I think I never like to, spread anybody in with one big brush. And we all say all the time, well, there's tons of great cops, and for every bad cop, there's 5 great cops. And this is not meant in any way to disparage law enforcement as a whole. It's meant to disparage those people in law enforcement who have decided that the rules don't apply to them, and that teenagers and high school kids are easy pickings. And once we pull them over for shooting off fireworks in a pouring rainstorm somewhere, we can then stick our nose in the car and smell the marijuana. Now they can't do that anymore.
Yeah, and look, you're a bit kinder to law enforcement than I. I think that when it comes to pulling people over, the only time a cop is your friend is if you happen to know them personally. Other than that, I'm suspect as to the motivation of every police officer that pulls you over or that you come in contact with. I don't think that, I think your likelihood of ending up in prison or in jail is significantly higher every single time you interact with a police officer. So in that case, look, I advise everyone to say no as well. I advise everyone to exercise their constitutional rights, but I also exercise caution because, what I can say is easy for me to do versus, there's other people that don't have the same abilities that, police officers are going to run roughshod over them. You give them advice to exercise their constitutional rights, and only to find out that, they go, hey, those rules don't apply to me for whatever reason, either based on economic stratification or based on race or ethnicity. There's a lot of times I don't think that, other people have the same ability to say no or stand up to a police officer that I have, being both an attorney and being, one of privilege. So it's a terribly unfair system. What I will say is that, in my case, I did not back the cop off, Larry. The officer pulled me over and told me he smelled alcohol in the car. So very similar to saying he smelled cannabis. I told him there's absolutely no way he could. I've been sober for over 8 weeks and studying for the bar exam. And he said, no, I smell it. And I said, no, you don't. He said, yes, I do. I said, no, you don't. And we got into a yes-no sort of argument until finally he's like, well, would you be willing to back it up and take a breathalyzer? I said, under one condition, I'll take a breathalyzer if you give me a true apology, a real apology for lying to me about the fact that you're saying you smell alcohol when there's absolutely not a chance in the world you do. He's like, fine, deal. I blew a 0.0, and he looks at me and goes, good luck on your bar exam. I go, what about the apology? Just have a good night. Would refuse to apologize. And by the way, I was pulled over for a bullshit reason to start with, of a guy that told me I swerved in a road that had a natural kink in the center line where you have to swerve right there. And they sit there on Saturday nights on Federal Boulevard in Denver and just nail person after person after person about 3 blocks away from a music venue and just get them where they say they swerved. I mean, I almost went out there with a camera just to record how many times they use this excuse if we pulled you over for swerving on a road that has a natural kink. So, again, even dead stone cold sober, and even knowing my rights as I did, and even being at a point where the reason I was sober is because I was trying to make sure I could pass the bar exam, they still weren't going to be honest to me, and they still weren't going to be honest to me even after I was honest to them. So I don't take the same view that you do, that there's a lot of good ones out there. I think there's a lot of people that go into the force with the expectation that they're going to try to do something terrific for the community, only to find out that once they get in there, they get their basis for being a police officer gets perverted with the job, right? And it's unfortunate because I think a lot of them had every great intention when they went in, only to find out that they got a lot of pressure from other guys to act a certain way or toe a line, or know that they've got a police officers union that supports them, and no matter what their behavior is, they feel that they are largely above the law. And I think that's where we need the wholesale overhaul in the criminal justice system. But every time we get an incremental change like this, every time we get something where a judge finds in favor of the new rules of saying, okay, you can no longer use the smell of cannabis or the smell of burnt cannabis as probable cause, it's one more chance that we have as citizens to fight back against that tyranny. So I'm thrilled about this result.
I think those are good points. And one other thing I did want to say about that is, a lot of times, it's easy for us to slam the courts as well, especially when it comes to marijuana-related issues, because the sense is that they always don't know what they're doing, and they're going to be very biased against it. But in this case, what I like is that both the trial court and the appellate court were willing to recognize that the decision that they were making flew in the face of established law in Illinois, but they were willing to acknowledge the changing landscape of the legality of marijuana in Illinois. And they said it's entirely feasible that somebody could have legally transported marijuana in their vehicle. The smell is there. You smell it later. Since there's a legal use for them to be having it now, which may not have existed before, what may have been okay at one time, arguably, is now definitely no longer okay. And I have to respect the fact that the courts at both levels there were willing to acknowledge that reality and make a ruling that took those into account.
Yeah, and then you have to ask yourself the question of what's next, because realistically, that same issue exists with drug testing. Right? I mean, you could smoke a joint and a week later still test positive for cannabis, and you haven't been inebriated in any way for that entire week in the intervening time, right? So all of a sudden you take a drug test, and that drug test comes up where you're above 99 nanograms or whatever the limitation is, whatever the company you work for says it is, and you're fired for your job for something you did in your free time a week previously, where they say, it still doesn't count. And it's very, very similar to, saying, yes, someone transported cannabis legally in my car a week ago, and, you're still smelling the residual effect. There's really not much difference there. So what do you think? Do you think we're going to start seeing a change in policy on the drug testing side as well?
Well, I think we are, and that's a great point and a great lead into our next story. And for me, I've always kind of capsulated this whole discussion and sum it up by saying it's really presence versus impairment, right? And you've made the argument perfectly. The fact that I smoked marijuana a week ago and it still shows up in a test has nothing to do with the fact as to whether I'm currently impaired. And we need people to recognize that. And lo and behold, here comes California. And the only surprise in this story is that they're the 7th state to protect workers who smoke marijuana while off the clock. And basically, that's what they're saying here, that, if an employer is going to test, then if an employee tells him, look, I got high last Tuesday or last Saturday or last whenever, that's if, in other words, if the employee can give a legal basis for having smoked marijuana during non-work hours, they can't use that test anymore as a basis to fire employees. Now, there are definitely lots of companies that do this indiscriminately, and they just do it because their insurance companies have told them it's cheaper to fire these people than it is to pay off a lawsuit if somebody gets injured or killed and they can show that one of your employees had tested positive for marijuana, right? But it throws this whole idea of impairment out the window. It puts employers in a terrible position about what to do. So at least this is a good start in the right direction, Rob, but I will never, as I say, I'll never forget. I can't bring the name of the case to my forehead at the moment, but it's the Arizona case from about 10 years ago where a guy got ticketed for speeding and his team put into evidence the fact that the metabolites in THC in your system start out as hydroxy, meaning they produce a psychedelic effect, which is where the intoxication level comes in. But within 2 to 3 hours after smoking, that begins to break down. And soon thereafter, the metabolites have become carboxy, and they no longer have active THC or psychedelic ingredients in them. But so the Arizona Supreme Court in that case recognized this guy's defense. He had been pulled over for DUI for speeding and admitted to smoking a joint a few nights before. And they got him for driving under the influence. And the court said he wasn't under the influence. We know scientifically. The only thing about that surprised me is that was 10 years ago. And we don't see very many employers or law enforcement employing that very relatively simple test. It does require a blood draw, but maybe at some point people will say, draw my blood and I can prove right now. Be nice if we don't have to do that. And maybe someday some techno nerd somewhere will invent something where they can just look in your eye and get that reading. But in the meantime, we know that the technology exists and we really don't have to. It doesn't even have to be a game. But until that technology comes along, what California is doing is the right thing to do.
Good luck in telling the libertarian side of this country that, go ahead and draw my blood. If the same guys won't, take a jab for COVID, you're going to tell me they're going to, say yes to a blood test and not say that's just a massive violation of their rights. I mean, look, I'm not even one of those people. No one's taking my blood. There's no way that I'm going to prove that, I'm innocent by saying that. The fact that you can even get people to be forced to take a blood test in this country for either a DUI as an intoxicant for alcohol or for cannabis, to me is just so completely and totally absurd. So yeah, there needs to be a better test for it, and there needs to be a test that shows that impairment doesn't exist at that time. But as I said, for a long time, cannabis, the smell of cannabis, the DUI side of cannabis was always a Trojan horse to get people for other crimes. It had nothing to do with the cannabis. It was a great way to actually go in there and try to figure out something else that they'd done, to search a car, to find other things that they'd say, okay, this is worse, whether it was a firearms violation or a parole violation or something else, or whatever it was just a great backdoor way for law enforcement to say, okay, we are now going to try to nail you for whatever we possibly can under the false pretense of we think we might have smelled cannabis. So the faster we can get rid of that, the better off as citizens we are, so we don't live in a police state dominated by people that can make up bullshit reasons to infringe on your rights. And that's how I really feel.
And that's good. Rob, we're nothing if not truthful on this show, right? So, you have to say how you really feel. And I really agree with a lot of that. And I'm certainly not advocating, the government's right to draw your blood. I am, though, suggesting that if you want to play fair, look, if you're an employer, and there is a way to do it. If you have valuable employees, maybe an employee is willing to do it to prove their innocence. Maybe they're not. And I'm not saying they should, but we know the technology exists. And so with that technology, it's really a shame that it takes, the legislature to have to come in and pass these kind of rules to protect something that we know should be protected. But again, the flip side of it is that they've given the protection. And so I applaud California for doing it. And, would hope that more states would follow through on that.
Yeah. Or you can go the alternative side, which is if you don't catch me smoking a joint or eating an edible or doing a bong hit, fuck off. Leave me alone. So it's, I've soapboxed enough on this one. I'm sure there's some other things we can discuss that are more interesting to our listeners than, how I feel about the way law enforcement treats cannabis violators, or users, I should say, not violence, But I know you've got some other fun things lined up.
Yes, and as we spin out of this and go back to the music, again, let's just not forget the primary thing that a court of law in the state of Illinois has ruled, that the smell of burnt cannabis or even raw cannabis in your car by itself does not give probable cause to search your car. Learn that, know that. Those are your rights, although not to be picayunish about this, but this is not the Illinois Supreme Court that's ruling. It's only the Illinois 3rd District Appellate Court. So I imagine it's only binding law if you're operating within the 3rd District of the state of Illinois. I don't know that it has statewide application. However, at least if it's out there and you're in a different district as an attorney, it gives you a case in Illinois that you can cite to for approval and hope the judges in your district are as equally as enlightened as they are down in the 3rd District.
Right on. And I think that lets us get back on the road again, huh?
Absolutely. Very clever. Yeah, even Dan liked that one. Go ahead, Dan. Let's listen to this one.
Come on to my front door. My front door was locked. Looked in my window, and my window was locked. Jumped right back, and I shook my head. Leaned down in my folded bed. Shot through the window, broke the glass. Never seen that little rounder run so fast. She's on the road again, showing your bone. That's your bone. He's been on the road again. He's on the road again, showing your bone.
Great tune. And once again, a breakout for the Grateful Dead on this night. We didn't hear the beginning of the song, but if you listen to that part of it, there's wild applause. This was the first time played since December 1st, 1966. That's 1,131 shows. And Rob, I do believe that that's even greater than the stretch of Fish not playing Olivia's Pool prior to Alpine in 2019. So not that there's competition or anything, but to pull a song back out after 1,000 plus shows, and a song that really didn't have a lot of playing time even then, and really came on more in the future. But I love that song. It's a great tune.
It is a great tune, and it's a great breakout, and it's a perfect song to play acoustically. So I think, that became a staple of their acoustic set as they went forward, and I think Bobby loved to sing it. But it's one of those songs that, as you pointed out in the pre-show, is a tune that was even predating the Grateful Dead and predating the Warlocks. This is going back to Mother McCree's Uptown Jug Champions, which is 1964, 1965, and as you said, it was also popularized by the great John Sebastian. So there's a lot of history to this tune, especially kind of in the folky circles.
Absolutely. I guess the original credit goes to Mr. Will Shade of the Memphis Jug Band back in the day. But even after the Dead brought it back, it turns out they only played it about 40 times from 81 to 84, mostly electric at that point. And then they just kind of dropped it, which is too bad. But that song and The Race Is On were always two of my favorite tunes off of Reckoning. And when my buddy Mike would play it for us while we were driving around the back roads of Wisconsin on our nights off from working at summer camp, we would listen to that album a lot. And this was always a good one. On the Road Again, love it. And the fans did too.
Well, I think a lot of those songs, both those songs are comical songs, right? As is Monkey and the Engineer. I think a lot of the acoustic songs they played had an element of humor to them that made those songs really fun. So it's one of the things I always liked about it.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And as long as we're on music, and let's just keep rolling along for a minute, those kind of songs, I would say, those kind of songs, On the Road Again and Races On, like we've been talking about, Not to Lay Me Down. But then all of a sudden, boom, they're right back into Birdsong, and we're going to hear Birdsong right now, played acoustically 42 years ago today. Go ahead, Dan.
Anyone who sings it tunes as sweet as passing by. Laugh in the sunshine, sing, cry in the dark, fly through the night. Don't cry now. Don't you cry. Don't you cry anymore.
one of my favorites. I always think for a late first set, I would say that's always, the one that would get the spaciest and sort of get the coolest that, you'd get as a fifth or sixth song first set, but acoustic is fantastic. And, if you think about the history of that song, it was broken out at the Portchester Capitol Theater in February of 1971. But, more importantly, it's dedicated to Janis Joplin, as Robert Hunter pointed out in the liner notes of Box of Rain, the lyrics book. And you have to think that Janis only passed away in October of 1970. So within 4 months of her passing, he'd already written lyrics to a song that would end up being a staple in the Grateful Dead's repertoire throughout the rest of their career, of just a beautiful memoir or memory of one of their closest friends as an artist, and Pigpen's longtime girlfriend in the late 60s, early 70s.
Absolutely. It's certainly one of Robert Hunter's more inspired pieces, I think. And what I really love about this, like we were saying before, this is a great tune to hear them play acoustically. Like you said, my whole life of the Deadhead, well, 14 years when I was 14 years when I was actually going to the shows when Jerry was around. Birdsong was such an important first set song. It was a chance, to really start to kind of get a little bit of that space going in your brain and really, get into the whole flow, the oneness of the Dead show where everybody's just kind of moving together. And it's a hypnotic song. It really, when Jerry's playing it electric, the jam in the middle of it is just this was a song where I definitely had my share of, as the Fish Kids would call it, type 2 jams, where somewhere out in the middle of everything, and all of a sudden they'd swing back around and say, I'll show you, snow and rain. You're like, damn, yeah, that's what they were playing. But, to hear them play it acoustic is great. It really lets them show off their voices, and it's such a beautiful song to hear played in that fashion.
Yeah, I always think it's the first set Dark Star. It's the one place in the first set where they really, really go out into that exploration territory, the way they would on, let's say, a Playing in the Band or a Dark Star in the second set. But, there weren't too many places to do that in the first set. Maybe like, Cassidy Jam once in a while would go, a little bit out there. But Birdsong was the one where you could say, okay, this could go for 13 to 15 minutes and just go, sort of outer space territory for a bit.
And it would, every time. And and I joke about the type 2 jams only because we just never gave a name to it. But, it was definitely one of those tunes where, if you were in the right frame of mind, you knew it was going to happen. It's like when you get to the dentist's office, he says, I'm going to knock you out. And you sit there and say, how long can I stay awake? You're going to eventually fall asleep. Same thing with Birdsong. If you just give yourself over to the song at some point, you're lost in it. And, Jerry's playing of it electric is so melodic and amazing and just sucks you in. And the acoustic is great, too. So it's a great show. We still have a couple more tracks to go from this. One a standard and one probably the greatest tune of all time, not to give it away. But back to marijuana news for a minute. Tell me what you make of this, Rob. Governor Newsom, your governor in your home state, has signed a bill allowing California to, I assume, California businesses to start creating interstate commerce pacts. Now, this is both fascinating and questionable because right now this would violate federal law in a pretty blatant way if people were going to go across state lines. But is California beginning to lay the groundwork to take over the marijuana world here when it all goes legal by trying to start reaching outside of the state in a more formal way?
It's a great question. And, look, I always believed in stare decisis and believed in precedent, until recently. I always thought the Supreme Court would largely stick with things that are settled law. And in this case, you're going back to Gonzales v. Reich, and Gonzales v. Reich going back to Willard v. Filburn before it, as far as the rationale for not allowing to cross state lines. But what's interesting is that Clarence Thomas has come out recently and said that if that same case, if Gonzales v. Reich came in front of him today, very likely he would have decided otherwise, simply based on the trajectory of cannabis incremental change from a state by state basis. So do I think that right now what California is doing is technically illegal? Maybe, but that would take an enforcement action to actually challenge it. And I think that if it went back up through the courts, I think they'd have a very, very tough time with the composition of the court. That's a very kind of libertarian federalist court in many ways, at least on issues they want to be. That would come back out and say no. The utility of what we decided back in 2001 or 2000, I can't remember the date of that, is now waned. There's no rationale to do it. So the other thing about this is you've got to read the rule. You've got to read the what Newsom passed, and it's still subject to a change in federal law. So they're creating these interstate compacts. They're starting it off with California trading with New Jersey. Symbolically, it sounds great, but I'm actually waiting for someone right now just to come in and just take a leap of faith and decide, we're just going to go for it. And let's see if the feds are going to do anything about it, especially if it's a contiguous state, like Oregon trading with Washington or California trading with Nevada or Arizona or anywhere in the Northeast. I mean, technically, there isn't a state from, Delaware, or I should say now from Virginia north along the eastern seaboard that doesn't have, legalized cannabis, at least, at the medical level. So can you not start moving, cannabis there if they created interstate compacts? Are you really going to get the feds coming in and saying this is an enforcement priority? I actually am a firm believer that if someone were to do that right now, or if the states were to do that, I don't think they would say a thing. I think that the feds would look at it and go, we're already not enforcing policy, and as long as you're staying within the confines of your state laws and it's a well-established and well-regulated industry, then we're going to be hands-off. Okay, well, prime example would be Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey that have all created very, very similar legislation. So in those three states, if they were to say we're going to create, an interstate compact between these, three states, I would think that it would be very unlikely to see any sort of prosecution. I wouldn't technically call it illegal. I would just call it the fact that the Supreme Court has ruled and is using very, very shaky ground on the aggregate effect test of intrastate commerce affecting interstate commerce. So again, very technical issue. All of us sort of legal scholars in cannabis know about it, but I'm ready to poke the bear. I'm ready for someone to try it out.
Well, I am too, but I have to start off by saying, as impressive as his frame of mind might be on this, it's always difficult to give too much credit to Clarence Thomas for anything. But I will say this about what he said. Just like we gave credit to the Illinois 3rd District for recognizing the changing landscape of legal marijuana, at least, Thomas is doing the same thing. And he's now recognizing that the landscape has changed such that, we really can't turn the clock back. If only he were feeling that way about gay marriage or some other issues as well. But, at least he settled on marijuana as one where though we would never know what he's really going to do until he does it. But it sounds like that it could give people a little bit of comfort. Now, I like your idea. My first question is, where's the D'Angelo brothers when you need them, right? Because wasn't this what they were always good at, leading the way in terms of...
Exactly. The most cavalier guys in cannabis history. Yeah, exactly. That's a great question.
And they just say, just come sue us, please, and then just hand it off to their attorney at the time, Henry Wykowski, to go fight. And back in the early days, Henry had a pretty impressive track record helping the D'Angelos move marijuana forward, which benefited all of us. But I think it would be a great thing to do. Certainly it depends on the state. And I love your suggestion of Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, because those are all states that almost naturally work together already anyway in terms of the way business circulates among the three of them. And it's much more preferable than, say, trying to go from somewhere to Idaho and having to put up with the local attitudes that you're going to get in a place like that, where I wouldn't worry about the federal government. I would just really worry the hell about the state government. So clearly it would have to go into a state that already has a program, but why not? And you're right. If it's contiguous, then you lose the idea of having to transport it.
Look, and I'll go a step further than that. And I'll tell you something as an anecdote that I don't think I've shared with you from Chicago last week, which is I met with a couple CBD companies that are now actually migrating into to THC Delta 9 sales and THC Delta 10 and THC Delta 8, where they're taking hemp-derived CBD and then they're putting it through a conversion process, which we all know exists. And and a lot of people are doing it and putting these products into bodegas in states like Texas or Alabama, where it was questionable whether or not they had the ability to do that with the Farm Bill as their shield. But now they're actually going straight after Delta 9. Like, it's no longer D8 or D10. It is Delta 9. And I met with someone at the show and asked her about it. She was a CFO of one of these companies. And I said, okay, look, I'm a firm believer that the DEA got this one wrong when they did the interim final ruling in 2020. And I wrote a white paper about it, which is up on my LinkedIn profile. And which, by the way, I met a couple people at the conference that said they read the thing, and it was influential on how they made a determination of how they're going to handle their business. But the belief that I've always put forward, and you and I talked about this just as friends and sort of legal scholars, of did the Farm Bill legalize all cannabinoids? And my contention is it did. The language is clear. I don't care what congressional intent is. What congressional writing is, though it's in the four corners of the Farm Bill, was very, very clear that they had legalized all cannabinoids. And even Scott Gottlieb, who at the time was the FDA chair, came out and said, "You knuckleheads, do you know what you just did? You just legalized every cannabinoid," as did several others in front of Congress. So now these companies, they're actually getting legal opinions on legal letterhead from their firms saying, yeah, we believe that as long as you're processing hemp, that hemp has been certified as below 0.03% THC on a dry weight basis, that if you put out a product where the ultimate product ends up at below 0.03% THC by a dry weight basis, you're good. Now you have to think that in a vape cart, 0.03% THC, when most of it's liquid, is a very small amount. So if you're going to these websites, and I started researching a bunch after we got back from Chicago, these guys are actively not only making it, they are sending it across state lines. And as of right now, the DEA is doing nothing about it, the FDA is doing nothing about it, the ATF is doing nothing about it, the USDA is doing nothing about it. So if you want to think about where the lowest hanging fruit for prosecutorial attention is, I would say it's certainly with those guys before it is with like legal THC state sanctioned businesses or state licensed businesses trading with each other. There's a lot more gray area with the Farm Bill than there is with Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey trading with one another. So if those guys are cavalier enough to do it, I don't know why we're like being so reserved in the way that we're thinking about moving cannabis across state lines. And if what Governor Newsom is doing right now is just opening the conversation, again, I applaud that, and I applaud Governor Murphy doing the same thing on the other side of New Jersey.
The North America legal cannabis market is expected to reach $32 billion by 2028. Unfortunately, recent cannabis stock market volatility has made it difficult for many investors to find opportunities to participate. Pura Verde Cannabis is in position to become the leader in the pharmaceutical cannabis movement through technology, innovation, and growth. As one of Oklahoma's top private label manufacturers, Pura Verde is seeking investors to help them bring their A-game business model to other states. To learn more about investing in Pura Verde, their 13 private label brands, and the advantage of being located in Oklahoma, go to puraverdecannabis.com/investors. This is not financial advice, so before making any investment purchase, we strongly recommend that you consult with your financial or investment advisor.
Absolutely. And the thing about this is, well, I mean, we've talked about this and the overreach by the DEA, and not the first time that they've done this. And I know you've written on it. Bob Hoban has done some stuff on it. A number of people have out there. And, the bottom line is, I don't think you have to be a legal genius to read the language of the Farm Bill. You're right. This is about as plain language as it gets. It says that all of its constituent cannabinoids are legal. It says they're no longer controlled substances, which is the same thing as saying they're legal. So
all derivatives, all salts, all isomers, everything that's associated with it, as long as the crop came down and tested out by dry weight basis as the crop at below 0.03%, then it's called hemp, and everything that follows it is legal. Everything. You can't decriminalize it and take it off the CSA only to say, oh, well, now it's back on because you did X, Y, and Z. Well, if you wanted to say that, then that's what the language of the law should have said. It will remain, hemp unless you do this, or this, at which point you are now, going back into the CSA. That's not what the Farm Bill says.
It does not.
So it's pretty clear.
It is very, very clear, and it's so clear that you're right that the people in government clearly didn't understand what they were doing at the time. And I would have no problem, counseling a client and saying, if the THC level in the final product itself, even if it's Delta 9, is 0.3% or less, for sure you're home free. If it goes above 0.3% or less, I guess you run into a problem, because at that point you do qualify as marijuana. And if you're in a state that legislates marijuana, and says you can only sell marijuana in the state if you have a license to do so, technically then you might run into a problem. But again, that's a state issue. That's not a federal issue. And the question is going to be, at some point, how much of the state's going to really care about this? States like California and Oklahoma and Colorado and Washington that are so big, I could see states like Illinois where they're really trying to keep an iron-fisted control over things. I don't know. At the end of the day, it seems to me that they put themselves in a corner, and they haven't had either the wherewithal or the balls to go back and try and correct it the way they want to.
Honestly, I think it's more than that, and I don't mean to throw some shade at the legislators, but I don't think the guys in Congress are smart enough to understand the issue. And I don't mean that I don't think they're intellectually smart enough. All of them. There's a lot of really bright people in Congress, but this isn't what they're focused on. They're focused on a ton of other things. when you think about trying to explain to them what happens through a distillation process, like a falling film distillation or a spinning band distillation, and how you take, a crude oil extraction with a CO2 process, and then, come out with something that has a certain percentage of THC, and then further refine that into an isolate or a distillate. This is so far over their heads unless they actually really took the time to spend hours and hours and hours with someone in the industry. And then even then, you talk about the final product. I mean, if you talk about like just a gummy might weigh 2 or 3 grams. Well, if you're thinking about by dry weight basis, that means if it's 1 gram, you've got up to 30 milligrams that you can put in there to stay at actually 300 milligrams. So you can put in there to stay at 0.03% by dry weight basis. You're never going to make a 300 milligram gummy, so anything like 10 milligrams or under, it's not even close. But that was never what they were thinking about, because at the time, Congress was like, okay, so you're telling me someone could smoke this stuff all day long and they wouldn't get high? And everyone's like, yeah. And they're like, okay, that's good enough for us. That was what the threshold 0.03% was all about. They were never thinking about extraction and conversion, because at the time, it's like very few people even thought that was a possibility if you weren't, really involved in the industry and you were already working on extraction. So it's a very technical question that I don't think they've got the ability to go back and rewrite the law unless they were to hire a couple people inside the industry to say, okay, really explain it to us, write it in succinct, plain English, and then, we'll go back to the floor and try to amend this. But as it stands right now, the Farm Bill holds, and the Farm Bill is clear in its language.
I don't disagree. I mean, I don't disagree with what you say about the members of the legislature, because I think that's probably, look, people say the same thing about litigators. We don't know anything. We just learn what we need to learn to go litigate our case. I can be an expert in something for 3 weeks to talk in front of a judge. But here's the thing. If you say to them, look, here's what no understanding marijuana can give you: money and votes. I can't think of anything else that motivates politicians more. And I'm hoping that at some point there are going to be politicians who are going to be willing to say to their chief of staff, go get me a guy who's going to come in and be my marijuana expert, and let's start looking into this thing. And, we all know the states that are the most obvious candidates for that. And some of those states already have legislators that are willing to do that. But I think we're going to reach a point where marijuana is going to demand people's attention, and you can't keep pushing it off, while we sit there and, fart around about whether we should turn into a Christian nation or not, thanks to whoever just spouted that. And Marjorie Taylor Greene or somebody was yelling today, we should all be I'm like, that's what really? You got $1 billion marijuana industry out there that nobody's focusing on, and this is what you want to talk about? That's the part that drives me crazy, is, setting aside for a minute how ridiculous the idea is, just the fact that they're wasting people's time talking about things other than relevant issues like this one is frustrating. We need to be at a point where people make this a priority, and people want to talk about the marijuana industry because they see the good that it brings to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this is probably, of all the shows we've done recently, Larry, and we've talked about how the industry is having issues, internally from a business standpoint. But it's rare you and I get, really deep into to legislation and into policy. And this has been a fun one to do it on, because we've had some great things to cover this week to decide, or to at least pontificate about. And, sometimes, as I said, sometimes we're more about the music, and sometimes we're more about the cannabis. And this week, I think we've done a nice job of balancing both, and hopefully we haven't nerded out so hard that people say, I don't want to listen to this crap anymore. But, these are issues that I'd love to dig into, and I know you do too.
No, I really do. And, we don't have time to dive back into it today, but I just leave it with this overarching question of, people have to be careful what they wish for, right? Because if the borders are eventually open and California can't start importing all over the place, who knows? We'll see. Going back to our friends at the Warfield Theater 42 years ago today, we're ready to spin our fourth tune, thanks. But this next one was always one of my all-time favorite Grateful Dead tunes to hear in concert. It's an amazing tune. It's beautiful every time you hear it. It's an electric tune, except when it's not. So let's listen to what it sounds like.
Just
the final breakout of the night, the first time played since May 8th, 1979, a mere 99 shows ago compared to On the Road Again. But what a beautiful tune, originally off of Mars Hotel, something I did not know, originally titled The Suicide Song, which I guess if you listen to the lyrics kind of makes a little bit of sense, but it's kind of a harsh name for any tune played by the Grateful Dead, and I love China Doll a lot better.
Yeah, I mean that song. I think there's certain songs that are meant to be played acoustic, and I always think about that song and think that it was born for Tom Constantin. The kind of having that harpsichordy sound to it as well, or even a like a hurdy-gurdy sound as well. But the one thing I'll say about it is, as an acoustic song, I always thought it was just perfect, which is why when the Dead started, or I should say when Garcia started playing the Stephen Kripe lightning bolt guitar in the early 90s, which a lot of people, as I said, we talked about this a couple shows ago, a lot of people complained had too much of an acoustic quality to it. One of the songs I thought that really, really benefited from that sound was China Doll. And if you listen to, I've talked about it before, the Fall of 93 China Dolls, they're exceptional because they have that sort of glockenspiel / acoustic tinny sound to it that resonates so beautifully with China Doll. So, if you're going to go back and listen to them, I think the acoustics and anything that was played with the Kripe lightning bolt guitar are two great places. Obviously knowing that they played amazing versions all the way through the 70s and 80s as well. But there's a certain sound to it that I specifically like more than others, and it's really that sort of high-end tinny sound on a China Doll.
Absolutely. What a great tune. And the harpsichord is always so distinctive when you're sitting there. Sometimes they'll play it out of space. Sometimes they'll play it going into space. Sometimes they'll play it anywhere around there. But as they slide into it, the minute you hear that harpsichord note, you know exactly what they're playing. And it's always a welcome song, very identifiable. And we may have discussed it on the show, but it's our good buddy One-Armed Larry's, one of his major claims to fame is at the 1984 Dead shows at the Philly Civic Center. He was up in the men's third floor restroom as the Dead broke into China Doll, and he called it, and the guy in the next trough over was very impressed at his acumen, even while taking a leak upstairs. So hats off to One-Armed Larry, and it's a great tune and always fun to hear.
Yeah. And as you know, is the only thing I ever got to ask Garcia directly was, when are you going to play China Doll in the summer of '95 when I met him. So it was, which, by the way, they did not play a China Doll that entire final tour, which was a great disappointment to me. But that was the one slow second set Jerry tune that, we got lots of So Many Roads and lots of Standing on the Moons and Morning Dews and Stella Blues, but there was no China Doll. So that's one that, kind of eluded me in the towards the end.
I hear you. There's always one or two that we just can't quite ever catch up with. Switching to musical news for a moment, our good buddy Phil Lesh has finally announced his list of friends who will be playing with him this year out for the Philoween, his 9-night run, that's now become an annual tradition for him out at the Capitol Theater in Port Chester. I had made it out there last year for my initial experience at the Capitol. I know your boyhood home, and it was wonderful. Unfortunately, I will not make it out there this year, although this will come as no surprise to you. My good friends Alex and Andy will be there on the 29th, and I'm sure after that maybe we can get Alex on the show, and you can meet him, and he can give us a breakdown of Phil jamming in the Capitol Theater.
Yes, the Bob Sacamano of our show. I still look forward to it. But dude, have you seen the lineup, man? There's so many great musicians. Like the first weekend's Krasno and Schofield, and Carl D is playing with him. Like when you think about these lineups he's putting together, and he's got Jennifer Hartswick. Yeah, he's got Ivan Neville from formerly of Dumpster Funk playing with him, and he's got Jen Hartswick playing. He's got the guitarist from Goose playing with him. Like it's like he is just curating so many great lineups, and I know there's certain ones you're partial to, but you look at what's actually being put together for this, and it's pretty impressive, man. Like it looks like Krasno's going to play with him a lot, but John Molo and Natalie Cressman, John Medeski are playing on the second weekend. I mean, look, this is going to be good stuff, man. Like there's no reason why if I could make it out there that I shouldn't try to go out at least for a night or two the way you did last year. But very likely I won't be able to. But man, what a lineup you just announced.
No, the lineup is nice, and you're right. I've always been partial to the original quintet, but setting that aside, because the guys in the quintet all have their day jobs and they're all doing very well doing it. This is an amazing group of musicians that he's put together. It is exciting. I know Jennifer Hartswick because it wasn't just last week we were talking about horns and fish tunes, and wasn't she the one who did a Susie Greenberg with them and blew the trumpet?
She wasn't the initial one to do it. That was initially Carl Gearshart and Dave the Truth Grippo and Russell Remington. But since then, Jennifer's done. I mean, obviously everything with Trey Band. But at this point, I'm pretty sure she played Susie Greenberg on that New Year's Eve when they kicked in the new year with the Susie about 5 or 6 years ago. I think she was part of that lineup. She's definitely played on Susie since, but the original Giant Country Horns was really who wrote the horn part for that.
Okay. Yeah, it is a great lineup, and we've often talked about the various cover tunes that the Grateful Dead played, or some of their spoken influences that helped influence us in terms of being exposed to other music and other genres and things like that. And all Phil is doing here is bringing that same gift back to us by surrounding himself with so many amazing musicians that people are bound to walk out of there saying, I've got to go listen to Natalie Cressman now. I've got to go listen to James Casey. I've got to go listen to any of these people because they were, and he's doing them a favor. He's doing himself a favor. It's just so wonderful that they all come together like that. And really, if you think about it, and we mentioned, you mentioned the Capitol Theater earlier as the show where they had originally broken out for the first time the Birdsong. And the Capitol Theater has always been home to many magical moments for the Grateful Dead, and Phil clearly living off of those vibes and bringing other musicians in so they can do it too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you think about that whole run, we covered it before, but I think they broke out 7 or 8 new tunes in that February 1971 run, including Loser, including Deal, including Birdsong. I think potentially Wharf Rat, I think, was in there as well. But there was a handful of breakouts for the first time that the Dead decided that was the venue they wanted to drop these on for the first time, and it's remained. The bar next door is called Garcia's, and it's owned by Pete Shapiro, who, the guy that puts together more Grateful Dead related stuff between Lock-In Festival and Fare Thee Well. Phil loves that venue. Phil just, if he's going to play anywhere, the only places he really wants to play more for a long time was either Terrapin Crossroads or was the Cap. And now Terrapin's closed down. It's the Cap. That's where we're going to get, Phil Lesh at age 82 years old now, still playing music. So hats off to Phil for doing that. And, I mean, I gotta say that I was super excited, and I'm gonna destroy his name, but Rick Mitaratanda, I think it is from Goose. He's got to be so fired up. I mean, that for him, that's his hometown venue. That's where he grew up. That's 20 minutes away from his hometown. So for sure, as a kid, he was seeing Capitol Theater shows. It's got to be like what a celebration, like what a prodigal son, kind of like moment when you get to go back to the Cap and play with Phil Lesh. It's I don't think he's ever gotten a chance to play with Phil before, and he's certainly gotten a chance now to play with Trey. But you want to talk about a person that's like the only person hotter in music right now is maybe Billy Strings than Rick is on guitar. So it's pretty amazing to see this happening.
It is, and what more beautiful way to kind of like show that bridge. I mean, here's Phil Lesh, the granddaddy of all of this, and he's sharing a stage with the guy who is, as you say, the lead guitar player for one of the, if not the hottest up and coming jam bands in the country right now. And the fact that at Phil, at his age is so interested in reaching out to so many of these younger musicians. We've seen Trey do it, of course, all the time. We know he's going to be touring with Goose, and he's been you can go on YouTube and see all sorts of walk-in moments with them. But I love it when Phil Lesh does something like this, and he's sending a message to all of these deadheads. Not that they necessarily need it, and certainly not that Rick needs this this type of affirmation. But boy, there's probably not very many jam band guitarists or musicians out there today that would turn down an opportunity to share a stage with Phil Lesh for a few minutes.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think everyone knows that this isn't lasting forever, and to get a chance to play with one of the all-time legends and a guy that the rest of the members of the Dead, and I love what they're doing with Dead and Company, but they're all still sticking to what they've always done. Whereas Phil has really branched out and said, "I just want to play with some really unique and cool musicians." And the fact that ever since Phil and Friends started, it was always a rotating cast of characters, and you had some guys that stuck around longer than others, but Phil has really gone out there and tried to do something unique the way that for a while Government Mule did as well in the early days of just playing with different people and trying different lineups. But Phil always finds a way to make it work, and he always curates just really, really cool bands of guys that love to play Grateful Dead music.
And I love the fact that at his age, he's so in tune with all of this young, hot music. He knows these guys. He knows what they're playing. to the point where he's interested in playing with them. And you have to be that fluent in the world. You can't just rest on. My kids tell me this all the time. You can't just listen to the Grateful Dead or even now the Dead and Fish anymore. There's all this other music. And not that I hadn't recognized it before, but Sacred Rose was really a great way to kind of, immerse myself. Now we've got Widespread Panic coming up to do their annual Milwaukee run that I'm going to try and get up to. Umphreys is coming to play up here on the north side of Chicago in a month or two. Going to try and get myself out to see some of those shows. And, kind of brings the fun back to music a little bit. You get to see new, exciting bands, some of them really young and just getting started. Some of them more established, but, all of them, really kind of, in the prime and going strong.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, I'll say that sometimes musicians, it's great for them to play with other musicians to stay in tune the way that, Phil's done. And honestly, Billy has done with Billy and the Kids as well. But then there's the other side of it, which is musicians decide that they want to cover certain band songs. And, there's certain Grateful Dead songs, one in particular, I think we're going to close the show with, and I don't want to steal the thunder from you on this one, that probably has been covered more by other bands than almost any other song I can think of, and it's already made its way into the Library of Congress as kind of an American treasure. It's certainly sung at camps around the country every summer as the fire's kind of dimming out. And of all the Grateful Dead songs that I think will be looked at 100 years from now, 200 years from now, and still have longevity, I think the one we're going to close with is it. Despite the fact that there may be some other songs that I like more to dance to or to sort of get a groove on. From a pure musical standpoint, I think the one that's had the greatest impact on other musicians is probably the one that we're going to close with today. So, before we do, I'll sign off and say thanks for another great show and for putting this one together, Larry, and I look forward to doing it again next week. But a lot of fun as always.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah. So, those of you who haven't figured out yet that we're going to play Ripple, will say what we're going to play because it is a great tune. And, when you look at the Grateful Dead catalog of songs, it's hard to find a tune that I think combines really just the best of Robert Hunter's lyrics and the best of Jerry Garcia's musical tunes and composition that he puts together, and the marriage of the two is made for one another. It's really like it's written by one person, and maybe that's how closely linked they were at that time when Ripple was originally created. We've all talked about the last time they played at Electric in '88 as a second encore for a Make-A-Wish Foundation grant. And then it was never played after that because they didn't have any more acoustic shows. It was a staple at acoustic shows, but Electric, unless you caught it at that Cap Center show or, the one or two other few times before that they had played at Electric, you would never get to. So
Garcia Band, Garcia Grizz.
Okay, fine. Thank you. The Garcia Band. Yes, I acknowledge that too. But, it would be like saying, well, never mind. If it's a great tune, I'd be happy to see Garcia play it anywhere, anytime. But this is acoustic, and this is the way I think the song was originally written. Many other tunes could go both ways. I like to think of a song like Friend of the Devil, Ripple, that these were traditional acoustic tunes that he later gave electric life to. And so we'll listen to this final Ripple, which was the first set closer of the show. They then came back and did a traditional two-set electric show. So people really got their money's worth at these outings. But listen to this Ripple. Enjoy it. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back next week. Be good, have fun, and enjoy your cannabis responsibly.
Is a fountain that was not made by the hands of men. There is a road, no simple highway between the dawn and the dark of night. And if you go, no one may follow. That path is for your steps alone. Ripple in still water, where there is no pebble to wind to blow. You choose to lead must follow, but if you fall alone. If you should stand, then who's to guide?
Thanks for listening to today's show. To check out more great cannabis podcasts, go to PodConx.com. Here's a preview of one of our other shows.
Hi, y'all. I'm Jo, host of Casually Baked, the podcast. If you're curious to explore the highly responsible side of cannabis, farming, and legalization, I'm here to help lighten the stigma and build your canna confidence. Download episodes now of Casually Baked, the podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. And journey with me through the evolving cannabis culture and discover how and why people like you are adding cannabis to their wellness toolkit. It's time to get casually baked.